All right, we're starting here. Uh, Welcome. My name is Tim Wright. I am starting a new video series on the Treatise of Reintegration of Beings by Martinez De Pasqually. Now, the thing that I wanted to do was go over some of the sections of the book. It is really challenging to read because one of the things that a friend of mine has told me is that the Elukoan must be approached on its own terms. So the thing about Martinez's treatise, we're not going to get into who should have been reading it and what are the details. I've done a lot of conversation on this particular text. What I think would be most important is if we just go ahead and review it for what it is. And what it is it's very, very beautiful. So if you'd like to subscribe to the Yellow Corn Research Channel. This is based on the Treatise of Reintegration of Beings. Now I'm going to use the Campenhout version. It's unfortunately out of print, but I will read the relevant sections to you. I had it printed and bound, and so I use it to reference. Now, there's so much in this text that I don't quite know how we're going to break it down. It's not going to be, the first thing, like I said, is that this is not a text that can be taken outside of the terms that Martinez defines. That's the first thing that should be known. We're not going to try to analyze the text by anything other than the text itself. That is very, very important. Now, there's some amplification that can be done to this book for sure, since it comes out of the hotbed of 18th century French occultism. So, if you want to bring in other people into that mix, it's definitely welcomed and appreciated, but it's not necessary. To understand the book itself, you don't need to have anything other than the book. But you see, the one of the main blocks that I've ever had to reading this textbook is trying to understand it based on what it's not saying. I know it sounds weird, but like reading it and trying to like see it through it between the lines, and for some reason in that big process of making it a whole production, missing out on the actual content of the book itself. So it's really weird how that happens. So this, what I did was I snagged the outline from the popular version. It's the Amwork version, and it goes through the sections really well. Now, Trevor Stewart first did this that I know of. His version's out of print as well. But the Trevor Stewart version by Sympiatron Books, it was really good in the sense that it broke the text down into what Martinez called types. So the types are the patriarchs in the story. And what his thesis is that these types have experiences based on the overarching metamyth of the Elukoan. So you cannot take this book and try to make sense of it out of other texts. It doesn't make sense. I've tried and tried and tried, and it doesn't make sense. And the terms that are used are specific to the system that we're studying. So, what's the first thing? So if you read this book and with frustration you get like through it and you start going, God, what are we talking about? It doesn't make sense here, but let's try to read it a little bit. So in the text itself, right in the beginning, it says that that there was a power before the beginning of time. That's important. And within the immensity of its own being, it emanated spiritual beings for its own glory. Now, that sounds kind of narcissistic if you were to give a personality complex to a overarching force that is beyond personality. But yeah, so if a human being, like if I was like, oh, I made these little beings and they're here for my own glory, seen in like those terms, it's extremely rude and presumptuous and kind of egoic. But in this sense, that it was so full of its own being, it didn't have the ability to see its own glory. So it had no understanding, no self reflection, no orientation of itself as the immensity. They call it the divine immensity. And you can go buy a lot of published books on this particular system. But so the divine immensity had no way of being outside of its being because it was all there was. So what this, and this is very similar to Kabbalah, where the Simsum in Lurianic Kabbalah is that the power withdrew from a little bit of the cosmos to try to experience what it was like to have itself as one of these creators. And I like that because it says that this divinity was so concerned, if you can use that word, about fulfilling its law that it wanted to make sure and spot check itself and to see if it was actually carrying out its own will properly. So it withdrew itself. And then it said in this space that it withdrew from, it created, and this is creation of withdrawing from something enough to give it an ontological distinction apart from yourself. This is very important, and we'll review this again as we read through. But these spiritual beings worship the Creator by means of a cult, and it's not like creepy cult language. A cult as by means of a set of thinking, by a set of practices. The Catholic Church says it really well. And by means of actions, words, and thoughts. That this was the cult, C-U-L-T-E, which God had fixed for them by laws, precepts, and eternal commandments. It is because of these laws, precepts, and eternal commandments which constituted a covenant between God and the first emanated beings that they were free and distinct from their Creator. So it's very cool the way that it goes into this. Now, if you read this and try to think of all these terms, which obviously cause a lot of confusion, it's really, really interesting to see that and if I could be wrong, tell me in the comments, and we can have this discussion. But that in order to be free, that this group of spiritual beings had to practice these precepts, laws, and commandments, because in doing so, it made it a covenant. There were terms of the promise, and this being says, I can't promise you free will unless you are willing to do this stuff. And he laid out these laws, precepts, and commandments. It's very vague in the beginning, but it gets even better. It gets really, really good. So we move along, right? And what were these spiritual beings before their divine emanation on page 2? Did they exist or did they not exist prior to being emanated? So we're talking about the realm of being and non-being. And it says the answer to this is that the first emanating beings had their existence in God, but did so without distinction as to their action. So they're imitating this power, which is like, it doesn't know it's doing anything, it just does it. And so in order for this power to have a created being, for us to come about eventually, these spiritual beings had to have complete and utter dominion over their being. But the only way that they could have complete and utter dominion over their being was to practice and constitution of these laws that gave them complete dominion over their being. It's so airtight when you look at it. I love the way that it's written. And I don't think anybody has ever explicated this particular nuance of the treatise. We talk about free will, then we start talking about is free will free, and on and on and on and on. And it's almost like it immediately challenges the individual to actually look into the reality of the statements being made, and it's almost like we have to admit, I choose this. This is my choice. I'm not smart enough to know why I chose it, but I chose this. So I don't know if it's smart, but I'm not participating in the cult enough to know why I made this choice. In The Matrix, one of my favorite lines is she goes, "You already made your choice. Now you're here to figure out why you made it." And the most important thing is, would you have done the defiant act had you known that you're making this choice? So it's really cool how we're kind of moving through the lines of perception and the hierarchical structure of the human being and our reason and thoughts that are coming out through Martinez here. Now Martinez, he was really working hard and turning this into something. I don't know if he turned it into something, but it turned into something unlike anything other that had ever been said. Boma doesn't quite go. Jakob Boma from the 17th century, 1600s, doesn't actually go into this particular portion of the doctrine that I'm aware of. So it really gets good. Now, it says further and further in the book, you're going to have to read it. And it says that these beings had knowledge of that which was not yet existence and which were yet to be brought forth from the Creator, because they are part of the being of this Creator. By practicing this cult, by practicing this covenant, they are actually staying within the being. They are not distinguishing themselves as apart from this being, which is kind of a blessing and a curse. Later on in the book it says, the reason why these beings aren't doing well is because they try to make themselves equal. In that sense, they're equal in being, but not equal in their emanative power. So it really goes through it. I don't know if you have all read this. Mostly we're all freaking out about who's got the best translation, who said the best words, but we're not paying attention to the actual ingredients in the food itself. Just trying to explain what it is rather than experience and have a wonderful discussion about what it is and in its own terms.